afternoon and welcome to our virtual gathering presented by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. We are the statewide membership-based historic preservation organization and our co-sponsor AIA New Hampshire. My name is Beverly Thomas, and on behalf of the Preservation Alliance, I'm pleased to welcome you to How the Working Class Home Became Modern, 1900 to 1940. Today's session is part of the Alliance's ongoing 2022 virtual and in-person programming directed at helping advocates of community projects, as well as old house and barn enthusiasts understand and maintain their historic properties. We appreciate AIA New Hampshire serving as co-sponsor of today's program and are pleased to have such great attendance, including our architect friends. A few housekeeping points I'd like to mention before we get started. Please make sure you are muted to help keep the background noise to a minimum. Today's PowerPoint presentation will run about 45 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Tom is also willing to address specific questions relating to specific slides during the presentation. Please use the chat function for questions, and I will be facilitating at the end of the presentation. We are honored to have Tom Hubka with us today, zooming in from Portland, Oregon. Although Tom is living on the West Coast, he has spent every summer of the last 50 years in Maine and owns a connected farmstead just over the state line in Bridgeton, Maine. Tom is Professor Emeritus from the Department of Architecture, University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Through almost 40 years of scholarship and teaching, he has attempted to link the practice and teaching of architecture to historical and cultural context. He has published widely on topics of popular and vernacular architecture, including his award-winning book, Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn, which is approaching its 40th anniversary with over 50,000 books sold. In his latest book, How the Working Class Home Became Modern, Tom analyzes a period when millions of average Americans saw accelerated improvement in their housing and domestic conditions. At the turn of the 19th century, the average American family still lived by kerosene light, ate in the kitchen, and used an outhouse. By 1940, electric lights, dining rooms, and bathrooms were the norm as the traditional working class home was fast becoming modern. Tom's extensive research and writing on the subject won his latest book 2 awards in 2021, the Abbott Lowell Cummings Award from the Vernacular Architecture Forum and the University of Mary Washington Center for Historic Preservation Book Prize. Today's presentation will offer insight into the transformation of the average American's domestic lives, revealed through the mechanical innovations and physical improvements of their houses. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tom. Thank you for joining us today, Tom.
Thank you, Beverly. I'm trying to advance and I can't advance.
Maybe try clicking on the PowerPoint itself.
Share screen. New share.
It's up, so it should. Okay, we just lost the share screen, so try again from the beginning.
Okay. There. That's the first. My advancer doesn't seem to.
Open it up to full screen.
There it is. It's working well. Okay.
There we go. Yay.
Thank you again, Beverly. I'm a rookie at this. Between 1900 and 1940, millions of average Americans experienced unprecedented improvement in their housing and domestic conditions. These improvements were intertwined with the acquisition of entirely new mechanical conveniences, new types of rooms and patterns of domestic life, and rising standards of living. This talk, based on research from my book, How the Working Class Home Became Modern, 1900-1940, interprets these improvements that literally transformed primitive domestic conditions for a working class majority into modern middle class standards in less than half a century. I'll be talking about houses on the scale of America. For you New Hampshireites, this will apply to you. And I know New Hampshire houses, and I'll try to point out some of them. But really, this is a discussion that I am claiming applies to all across the country, including New Hampshire. On the screen, I show you two types of houses, an upper middle class Tudor Revival style house on the left, and on the right, what I would call a front gable vernacular working class house on the right. These are the two constituencies that I contrast throughout the talk. I claim that the house on the left and houses like them, larger houses, are more frequently examined and as part of the story of improvement in America. And regardless, you can agree or disagree with that, I will be focusing on houses of what I interpret as a middle majority of Americans, 80% of housing, and talking about the improvement of those houses. I claim that they're similar stories, but it's the differences in these stories that I think I will emphasize throughout this talk. If you go through the literature of American housing reform for the early 19th century, I think you will find the majority of literature concentrates on the type of houses that I have here. We can call them upper middle class, rich folks' houses, Marxist or whatever. But the majority of the literature does focus on these types of houses. In order to set the conversation, I think, in the direction that I would like it to go, I emphasize a term that I use throughout the book called middle majority. And as you see in the graph here, it's a 60% of the middle economic portion of distribution of the population. Another way to say is that 20%, what I'm not talking about today, of houses of an upper middle class. And I'm also not talking about 20% of we say lower working class houses. So it's 60% in the middle. About the lower 20% of people in poverty also, this would include, and the dates I'm looking at are 1900 to 1940, and I'll talk about why I would choose those dates to talk about these kinds of houses. But during that period, this would exclude most people in this lower 20% would be the historic minorities in America, Native Americans, African Americans, and Asian Americans primarily. So focusing on the middle 60%, middle majority. So here are the houses that I look at. And I go around the country. I've done this for the last 20 years a lot, and before that, I did it informally. But if you look at these houses, these are the houses that I claim that brought improvement to the majority of Americans, this middle majority. And if you're familiar with houses, like for instance, this bottom right corner over here, it's a Cape type of house. Becomes popular in the late 20s, 30s and all. But the rest of these are maybe unfamiliar to some of you. There's a high proportion of multi-unit housing, which the working classes achieved modern conveniences within these houses. So I hope you become more familiar with these kinds of houses after the end of the talk. But these are the types of houses I'm talking about. My shtick, my main idea is that there are houses built before 1900 here on the left were improved by either remodeling or building new houses to houses that look like this on the right. So houses on the left become houses on the right for most people. And if some of you aren't familiar with these kinds of houses, you could say, well, they don't look very different. And that's part of the point, because they don't look very different. They're smaller on the left, a little bigger on the right, a little newer. But inside these houses, a tremendous revolution occurred. And that's really what I'm talking about. It's a quality of life, domestic conditions, the life of the people inside these houses, which I will try to communicate them by talking about the outside, but it's inside that I am primarily talking about. In my book, I claim that there are 9 major improvements in early 20th century domestic reform for this middle majority. And these would be the dominant, most important improvements, so that most people in 1900 did not have this list of improvements that I'm talking about. By 1940, 75%, I think, would have a majority of these improvements. So the first one, and probably most important, is public utilities. This is water, sewage, electricity, gas, a little bit, and telephone. And they become public utilities during this period in some ways. Easily the most important, and the acquisition of these within these houses becomes the story of a larger part of the story of improvement. And it's the differences between upper and middle class that I will emphasize. Second, the 3-fixture bathroom. There's no constellation of improvement that is more strategic than the 3-fixture bath. For those of you, this is a term that I use, the sink, the toilet, and the shower or tub. It's a holy trinity. From my Catholic education, it has that. This is what genuflect in front of this term. It has that kind of power to change the lives of the domestic lives of people. Before bathrooms or after bathrooms, a tremendous change, and this occurred during this period. Kitchen appliances, all range of kitchen appliances, including in this list is a washing machine, and probably most important in some ways for domestic improvement, but refrigerators and stoves and things like that, and storage areas are very much part of this. The kitchen becomes modernized during this period for most people. Dining rooms appear. In 1900, most people don't have dining rooms. By 1940, half of Americans have a place they could dine in outside the kitchen in some ways, and whether they did that or not. Private bedrooms, the word here is private. There are bedrooms ever since Adam and Eve, but it becomes the issue of privacy. Parents can have privacy from children, children have privacy from themselves and things like that. A little bit, and this occurs, and it did not occur before that. The houses become larger and better constructed. The balloon frame and other inventions, but particularly the manufacturing of doors and window units, spectacular development, and then this percolates throughout the country. Closets, it's a small item. In 1900, most people don't have closets. They don't have much to put in closets anyway. And the cornucopia of American industrial production of goods and services churns, and the roaring 20s, I think, is a mark of the production of stuff for the house. Closets appear in working class houses. Less important, recreational porches. In the bungalow, you could call it the 8-hour porch, symbol of a workday that allowed recreation for the first time. And the automobile, always there as a symbol of American development in anybody's list of improvements. So I claim, and other people, this isn't revolutionary. Other people would say that this constitutes domestic reform in America during this period, but it's how this is distributed in houses to whom is really the question. So but remember, in 1900, most people do not have this a list of improvements in their house, and they will gradually start to get them by 1940, 80% maybe. So I go back to the slide image that I had before, and I'm going to focus now on houses that existed in 1900. And so 120 years ago, I asked you, what were the dominant houses in America that Americans lived in? And so it's this list that we'll be focusing on right now. So if you can answer that question, we can't answer that because there's no census of house plan types and all that. And so this is my best guess from going around the country at all the resources I can. And this is my list of the dominant houses that most Americans live in more than any others throughout the country. For those of you in New Hampshire, well, I'll just go through the names. House, Side Gable, Workers Cottage, Shotgun, 4-box, Side Hall, tenement flat, early bungalow. Now, if some of you house people have never heard of those names, it's for good reason, because these are houses that you don't document very much. We have stylistic terms, Greek Revival, Colonial Revival, things like that. But these houses, you can't stylistically classify them very easily because stylistically it's a muted kind of style. With other geographer types and architectural historians, we have names that have just come along. People like me name them, house. This one up here. Most of you in New Hampshire would recognize a hall and parlor type house. It's a 2-room type house like this. Would be a stock 1800 house for a common folk in New Hampshire and all that. The rest of these are houses throughout the country. Another house that is common is this, what we call, architectural historian types call a side hall. If you think about the connected farm type of house in all the New Hampshire towns and small towns and villages, if you open that front door, you've got a staircase running up. That's what we call side hall. There's a floor plan of that. Very popular in New Hampshire, turn of the century. Some of you might live in a house like this. They were built throughout the state and without bathrooms, without all the equipment that I was talking about. But here they are, a list of houses that I would say constitute what most people lived in most of the time. Although, during this period, 1900, 10 years either way, many of you know about Victorian houses with large Queen Anne Revival type of houses, the ones that are usually recorded. But here's a list of houses that most people lived in most of the time. I would say it's an average of 3 or 4 rooms. In 1900, most people had 3 or 4 rooms, average domestic conditions in America. So although probably if you look at your history books about housing at the turn of the century, you'll see houses like this more often. But I would claim that these are the houses that existed, and these are the houses that will be improved, either removed or, and improvement was gained by half the population by 1940 in remodeled houses. In other words, houses that were constructed before 1900 or after 1900 without improvements that were improved. Bathrooms were added, kitchens were remodeled, things like that. So it's a big source of remodeling for average folks. When you get up the economic scale, you build new, you build everything fresh, and that's a different way of talking about improvement. So here are some of the houses I'm talking about. So common houses throughout America, and this is the closest one to your New Hampshire hall and parlor type of house. Throughout the South and the Midwest, it's ubiquitous, called an I-house by geographers. I apologize for terms like that because most people don't call things like that. In New England, you do have this L sticking out the back, a kitchen that would be remodeled. The kitchen originally might be in one of these 2 rooms and then added out the back. Very common in New Hampshire and throughout America. The side gable, if you come from the Midwest area over here, Wisconsin to Oregon to Ohio, lots of different ways to label this. In the Midwest, it's called temple. Here's the temple, and then here's the wing or side gable. Shippo and others, we don't agree on how to label these things. But anyway, here's some pictures of this kind of house. Extremely popular during this period, built without all the improvements that I was talking about. I'm just showing these to show you that there are these houses that will be improved or replaced. Here is the only regional house on my list. This is and many of you know this term, shotgun. It gets its name because we can open this door, and usually there's a line of doors that presumably you could shoot a gun through the house and it wouldn't hit anything. and all that. This is the only house. This is attributed to African Americans. So it's a regional house and extremely popular in the South as a very modest 3 or 4 room type of house. Last of my little snippets here. Workers' Cottage. I've done a lot of research in Midwest cities like Milwaukee and Chicago. Any small front gable type of house you could call workers' cottage throughout America, and it would be about correct. But there is a Chicago version of that, which lines up small rooms along one side and a parlor, living room, and a kitchen, making it a Chicago or an urban workers' cottage. So stylistically, like here's a workers' cottage with some Victorian trim on the exterior, but usually they look like this, and we can't name them stylistically. I would encourage floor plan analysis. You can name a house by the exterior, and you can also name a house by the interior. When you look at working class houses, I think you're better advised to use floor plans. You'll get much further than you will by stylistic analysis. So all these houses that I've shown you here, I've talked about the exterior of the houses and the exterior, but what we need to talk about in terms of improvement is the domestic conditions that were improved on the inside. And here's a list of 6, I could do 18 or 7 or whatever, of major domestic conditions that were typical of people who lived in these houses. And I emphasize this because it's different from what we will achieve as an American, more unified domestic conditions. The first one is kitchen-centered living. And it simply means that the kitchen is the heart of the farmhouse. It's the major place of women's work, major place of living. In places with any kind of cold, the kitchen has the only heat source in working class houses. So you gather in the kitchen for half the year, at least, in relation to the rest of the house. So these are pictures from New York, or usually the urban tenements of New York that were photographed. We don't have pictures of the working class in houses at the turn of the century, just none. And we have a few here. And so the idea of 3 or 4 multi-functioning rooms. So here's a kitchen in a tenement in New York, but it's a workshop. They're making clothes. It is the kitchen, and here's the kitchen storage. And here's the bedroom, in the back. The location of beds within kitchen areas was ubiquitous in working class houses for lots of reasons, child care, and others. So it's a different way of living. Lack of privacy, a slam dunk. Rooms are lived in that are multi-purposed. Privacy does not exist for a working class in some ways. This is an acquired taste. The kings and queens and the upper class has this by the 19th century, not in the working class. Minimal utilities, easy way to say that, there's no bathroom. So if you live without a bathroom, you know that it's a different way of living. There's additional family members. I emphasize boarding, and look at this picture down here. It's a rare picture. This is a living room of presumably a working class house with boarders who use this living room as a bunkhouse. And they presumably are night shift workers who douse the windows in the daytime. Anyway, extraordinarily rare photograph. Multifunctional is another way of talking about eating in the kitchen. A tremendous dividing line between upper class dining room with servants perhaps, and a working class a photograph of an Italian family in New York eating in, here's the kitchen stove and kitchen storage over there. So it's a different way of living in 1900 for most people. That will change. And if I had to summarize the way of eating, the upper classes during this period, about 1900, we have hundreds of photographs of great dining rooms without people. We have 1 or 2 photographs of the working class eating, and this is used by most historians because we don't have that picture of people gathering in the kitchen and eating, because it also wasn't proper to do that also, and therefore you didn't photograph it. But anyway, and it's interesting that today we do that, right? We now can eat in the kitchen because it's now popular. Culture has moved on in interesting ways. But anyway, let's not get on today. This contrast existed. This is the heart of two, I think, lifestyles, an upper middle class and a much larger 80% working class on the right. And then we have here the bungalow. And I go off the rails here a little bit and say the bungalow it should have, we should genuflect for the working class in front of this name. It puts together all the reforms that I've been talking about in a package that was standardized and reproduced throughout America and became one of America's most popular houses. Now, many of you know the bungalow. I apologize for the term because that's the only word we have. It's a Bengali term from India, borrowed by the Brits, come to America, but it represents a single family house with all the improvements that I was talking about. It's the house that the middle class achieved: the first bathroom, first 3-fixture bathroom, the first dining room, separate dining room alone, a kitchen with amenities, on and on, all the improvements that I've been talking about, packaged in a fairly standardized form. Now, many of you are schooled to think about the bungalow style, arts and crafts style, barge boards and rustic things like that. That's okay, but it's the bungalow floor plan that dominated. And here's the bungalow floor plan. Again, there's a trinity. You can tell I had Catholic education. The trinity is living room, dining room, kitchen. You ever walk down a house and it's living room, dining room, kitchen? That's the bungalow plan. On one side is living room, dining room, kitchen, public rooms, if you want to think about that. And then in private rooms, if you want to think about bedrooms and bath on the other side. An American standard becomes one of America's most popular homes in terms of the organization, and built millions of houses throughout America. Just to focus a little bit more on the bungalow brought taste, culture with it, domestic culture. And one of the motifs of the dining room and living room was it arts and crafts. It's historic medieval, English medieval type of Morris organization. But the working class never had architectural styles. They had minimal kinds of historic English woodwork a little bit, but that they acquire this historicism for the living room, dining room. But if you then enter the kitchen of the bungalow, it transforms into really what is a modern room with modern appliances and modern surfaces, tile, stainless steel. Working class never had any of that, and now they have it in a functional modern. So anyway, this contrast became a kind of acceptable standard for domesticity throughout America in improved situations. So I'm a professor, and so I hopefully you're the class, and I give you a quiz. And so what bungalow characteristic is shared by each of these houses? And so I've done the country here. Here's Milwaukee, where I used to live, and then Portland, Oregon, I live now. And many of these are some of the most popular houses there. But here's Boston, if you've been to Boston, and Buffalo. These are duplexes in Buffalo, also duplexes here in Chicago, done this way. You know what they share? Ta-da, drum roll. They share a similar floor plan. And we don't have a name for this. The only name we have is what I would label, and my colleagues would label, a bungalow floor plan. But we're not talking style here. So it's this floor plan, which organizes usually rooms this way. All these 6 very popular houses in America have the same generic floor plan, this bungalow floor plan. Easily one of the most popular floor plans in America, easily, before World War II, before the advent of the American ranch, which becomes America's most popular demographic house in America. So here it is, all across America. This bungalow floor plan is the floor plan of modern domestic reform. Other houses achieved with the bungalow floor plan, like this duplex that you have here, but other kinds of houses were remodeled during this period, and including multi-unit houses. Multi-unit houses has come down a little bit in the world today. It's a second home or alternative living, but single family houses after 1950 become the way that most people chose to live in. But during the early 20th century, all these multifamily houses usually had advanced utilities and were considered modern houses during this period. So 50%, I claim, of Americans achieved their first house with modern domestic conveniences in multi-unit houses. So when you go to Boston and you see the three-deckers, sorry, these Boston three-deckers, understand that those, whatever they look like now, they were modern homes. They were three identical homes on top of each other, and they were modern, and they had all the facilities that constitute modern living. So multi-unit housing is very much part of this equation. My favorite in the multi-unit house is the common duplex. This is the workhorse of the working class. And these are all houses with two families. And so here's a Polish flat. So there's a family below and a family above, and you can raise this house and build under it. But here's Milwaukee has more duplexes than any other city in America per capita. And here's these are common duplexes in that city. But here's a shotgun from Macon, Georgia, but it's a double because it has two shotguns side by side. And so here's side by side duplex too. If you go on my field trips, you're always looking for duplexes. You're looking for your two doors and all that. You're looking for your two bays. That two bays usually indicate duplexes are out there. How exciting is that? Well, very exciting.
I just wanted to give you your 12:30 warning, okay? Okay.
Moving into high gear here. So here is a chart from my book that shows you the kind of duplexes in America. Now that you're alert to duplexes, the most popular is the 1/1. It's called two flat in Chicago areas or something like that. So here's 1/2 over, and it can be side by side. And here's side by side duplex. More rare is front to back here. The Milwaukee's Polish flat is one up and down, but you dig underneath that to get a basement apartment. And you can have two units on the same site, which is also, I think, a duplex. Anyway, very much popular in America. And then you add to that subdivided houses, which is a whole big category of how working class achieves modern domestic conditions in houses that are subdivided. I take that on, but we can't emphasize that here. So let's say you say to me, oh, Professor Hubka, that's really a good subject. I really want to study this. This is really exciting. And I said, oh, that's good, but you have to be careful because there's a lot of misinformation about common houses out there. So now I will go through misconceptions about how common houses were improved and reformed in the early 20th century. So here's some things to watch out for if you get the bug and want to look at common houses, because it isn't always studied, I think, in some ways the way it should. Well, here's something that I think many of you know something about, the kit house. Now, is there anybody out there who doesn't know what a kit house is? Maybe if you came from Yakutsk and you never lived in America, you might know that. But most of you know, and if there's one person out there, I will tell it. This is the story of a house that, for instance, a client would read a book and a Sears catalog, like the one we have right here, and pick out a house and then order it. And then you'd probably go down to your local railway station, and then this boxcar would arrive, and every single stick and joint in that house would be in that boxcar, and you unload it, and you build it. Kit house, right? Sears, Montgomery Ward, you know the names, Gordon Van Tyne, you got it, right? Nothing wrong with that, except read the bottom two lines. Less than 5% of houses built between 1900 and 1930 were kit houses. 5%? Hey, that's minuscule, okay? Whew. But why do you tell the story of the kit house? I lecture across the country, and do any of you know the story of kit houses? Every old guy in the room raises their hands. I can tell you that. And it becomes a dominant story. And it's a cracking good story, but it's a story of a very small percentage of the housing population. It's easier to tell. Researchers like me can research it's a piece of cake. The harder story is this upper picture here, this America was built, the houses I'm talking about, by independent contractors who build one or two, 3 or 4 houses a year, and they're hard to research. So you might want to research something that's very easy, get a house. Very rare relative to the 95% of other houses that are the real story of how it's built. So study real builders, very difficult subject, but I have written on topics like this. I can tell you it's very tough, but that's where you want to be talking about houses. So I love kid houses too. It's a great story, but it's a rare story. And you want to emphasize that in your housing research. Owner-built houses. Okay, now once stung twice shy, I'm going to say many of you would emphasize owner-built. Now you in New Hampshire, of course, you know that the early pioneers, they built their log cabin, right? Well, yes, okay. After the Civil War, less and less, and to about 1930, owner-built house becomes smaller and smaller to only a rare portion of houses after 1900 become owner-built. I know for some of you, there's a takedown here because the Depression era was lauded that way, but it isn't the case. 95% of houses are built by contractors in standard ways and all that, and we research that. So be careful about the owner-builder myth. It's out there. It's a great story. Even farmers, they can build anything. They don't build their house. They get real builders to build their barns and houses and all that, as we know. So less than 5% of houses during this period were owner built. So be careful of that one. If you study the technological development during this era, like how do you make toilets and plumbing and stoves and things like that, the literature is very complex and you have to be careful, and even things that are very clear. So Thomas Edison, development of electric light, 1880 to 1890 or so, easily, you get it. But what we're interested in here is distribution. How is electricity distributed to local people and all that? And that subject is very difficult. Obviously, the rich and famous get electricity first, and local industries that support that, and then it's distributed to more and more people. And that's a difficult story, and it isn't always equal. It goes all over the place. So be very careful about that. Just a couple of factoids here. Here's a chart I have from the book. It's kind of obvious. You have experimenters and the wealthy get water supplied early, and then the masses get it. So if you look at the standard utilities during 1900 to 1940, this is when most people, and in the middle of this is 50% of people get gas here by about 1930 or 25 or something like that. Anyway, it's how you would expect this to develop, but there's some caveats here also. By the way, if you want to do your own research, you can do this with either your family, how they've moved to different houses, or the history of your own house. When did your own house get the first electric light bulb, the first, toilet? The toilet's a good one and all that. Most people are kind of shy about what it means to get your first toilet because you didn't have one before that. So it's a statistic that's hard to get. This is the Eisenhower household. It's very famous. Eisenhower's a famous guy and all that. But you could do this with your own house or any house, and it's a hard thing to do. But I think you would get the spirit of this reform that I'm talking about. But when you do this, be careful that there's a history of technologies and its distribution that is two-sided. There's people with wealth and average people. So here's gas, okay, gas lighting. Any of you read novels and you see the gas, the fires, the lights are burning, and you see the dining room and you have guys with cigars and then the gas is burning. It's beautiful, right? It's part of Victoriana. Be careful. Be careful because the vast majority of American households were never, ever lighted with gas in any period. Never. How did they have light? Well, let's do it, New Hampshireites. We had candles for a fireplace and all that if you wanted, candles. And then maybe whale oil, we're pretty close to the coast and all that sort of thing. But kerosene takes over after a while. It becomes the light. And then what? Electric light. Okay, did you see it? Okay, working class, 80% of people never had gas. You farmers out there, you never had gas until you had bottled gas or something like that coming in. So be careful. You can go through other utilities and it's the distribution. But one I didn't mention that I should was the toilet. The toilet emerges as a 3-fixture bathroom in houses of the wealthy quite early, 1870s, 80s, and all that. The working class gets its first toilet not in a bathroom, often in a different room because it's added to a house or something like that. So the toilet standing alone between bedrooms or something like that was ubiquitous, often in the cellar. Anyway, it's a different kind of history. Be aware of that. Be alert to that. Here's a different kind of history too, and I call this the shrinking house theory. And those of you who study Victorian, I give tours in Portland, Oregon. I love Victorian houses, nothing wrong with that. And give me a good Queen Anne house. I'll wax poetic in front of it like anybody else. But most of us unconsciously will look at houses like this and take up the paradigm in some ways that houses like this that were big and had smoking rooms and nurseries and things that were downsized to houses reformed for the middle or upper classes. And then these were downsized for houses of modern ranches and things like that. Good story? Well, it happened, but the problem is that you're mixing different classes of people to tell that story of Victorian downsizing or something like that. Most people in the Victorian era or late 19th century lived in small houses like I showed you right here. And then they graduated to slightly larger houses or expanded the houses or something like that. So America's houses got finer and slightly larger from the 19th into the 20th century. We can prove this easily by any demographics if you want. If you're not interested in demographics, you could go back to this one and say that the rich folks downsized a little bit too. But anyway, this is what happened in America mostly. Statistics are difficult to come by. A lot of historians have suggested that this downsizing I'm talking about here, but they haven't been counting most people most of the time. So here is the houses that I've been talking about, the selection of houses that have been reformed. So these are houses of a domestic reform. Some of them have been remodeled and then added to become reformed kind of houses. And others of these are stock houses that have been produced millions of times throughout the country. I'd like to conclude with a story of one house, and it's not representative of all houses, and it's an average, typical working class to lower working class house in terms of form, but it has an interesting ending in some ways that I think is enlightens us about it. So here's a house, a photograph of a family from Homestead, Pennsylvania. Homestead was the site of the Homestead, the Carnegie Steel Works, the great strike. I've done research in the area. The standard house is we call a 2-up and 2-down house, and this is what we have here. And I'm going to read you something from Margaret Byington. She's a social historian, but really she interviewed families like this from the mill and to find out housing conditions. And so this is her quote about looking at this family here. The kitchen, perhaps 15 by 12 feet, was steaming with vapor from a big wash tub set on a chair in the middle of the room. On the other side of the room was a huge puffy bed. Near the window stood a sewing machine, in the corner an organ. All these besides the inevitable cook stove upon which in the place of honor was simmering the evening's soup. Upstairs in the second room were a boarder and the man of the house asleep. 2 more boarders were at work, but at night they would be home to sleep in the bed from which the others would get up. The husband returned here for the photograph. So here we see it's a 2-room house. It's a subdivided house. The staircase goes up there, and outside there's another part of the house, which another family lives in. So upstairs is one room, downstairs is another. And here we see the typical components of what many families at the turn of the century have. They have a cook stove. Cook stove is one of the greatest industrial revolution inventions of the 19th century. New Hampshireites changed between fireplaces to stoves, usually about between 1820 to 1850 or so. They got stoves. Behind this stove is a sink. You can't see it over here. This house had piped plumbed water. That would be the second major feature. The outhouse is through the door. Out over here, there's one electric light in the ceiling, and they have one room here. So to analyze what you're seeing here is, here's the typical what we call two-room over two-room house. So usually it's two downstairs rooms, parlor and living room, two upstairs bedrooms over here, but in this case it's subdivided down the middle. Working class subdivides. It has done that forever, and they did it here. So here are the two rooms. Here is the plan of the room you're looking at. So it has all the features, and here is the border bedroom upstairs. What this room is the border dining room. You can't see the table right in front of us over here, but we see the pile of border and family clothes here. She will be consumed by that for most of the day as border wives, and then making a meal for the boarders there. The issue of boarders is out there. It's much more prevalent than we would normally think about. But there's also the issue of orphan children and aged parents and things like that, which certainly occurred in houses like this too. So it's a much more crowded situation in smaller houses. So here's this typical house and living environment. So I study houses like this, and you can too. And you could be grim about all this, but you heard her say, Margaret Bryant, in the analysis, that over here in the corner was an organ, okay, and a sewing machine. Whoa, wow, okay. And look at this. This is new dining room furniture and new bedroom furniture here. La-di-da. This is interesting stuff. That's a better pendulum clock than I'll ever have in some ways. And look at this framed art. What we see here is a working class family, all the characters I'm saying, but they're bound for the middle class. And unless she dies in childbirth, or he dies in the mill in a mill accident, which is quite prevalent, I think they're going to make it. We don't have the history of these people, like most working class histories. We don't know who they are and all that, but we have more information about them than we have about most. But it's this acquisition of stuff. We also don't have novels about them thinking about going to, they're silent in the history. But here we have a record, I think, of those people, of their aspirations. And those aspirations that I think made the improvement that I'm talking about. Anyway, I think it's a great story. You can read my book about it, and it's an American story. And if I may, it's certainly my story. Hubkas go back into Belarus and get lesser and lesser improvements and all that. And I know where they came from and all that. But for many of you, although you've usually read about the manner of the European manner house and all that, and even the big house, or if you're south or whatever, most of us come from more, I think, common environments that we have not studied so well, but I think we can. And it's a beautiful story when it improves like this one. So thank you very much. I can take questions if you like.
Thank you so much, Tom. Fascinating. And I love this historic photo because it represents so much and it says so much. I don't see any questions in the chat, so don't be shy. Put some questions in there. I do also want to mention, I forgot to mention earlier, that this program is being recorded, so you can view it. I think we'll get it up on our website possibly tomorrow or the next day. If you want to view it again. I know someone was having trouble with seeing the photos relating to her phone. But Tom, I do have some questions to start, and then hopefully people will chime in a little bit. You had said, I believe at the beginning, that you had spent 20 plus years researching this topic. And I'm just intrigued and wondering what got you interested in it in the first place.
Well, they're my people.
Okay.
It seemed to me that the housing research that I was reading did not focus on houses that I was discovering. I go from town to town. Once I got going with this, I can call any city in America, and I can vector some of the best historians to set me up with the best plumbers in the city to take me around to look at houses. So if you just appear in a city and start thinking about what could it be, so by doing your homework, I perfected a way of visiting a town for 5 days, but mapping with the best people imaginable with local neighborhoods to try to get typical houses. And I was after the numerically dominant houses of the city or the neighborhoods. And that's important because you can fog out very easily in house types. It's just because it's endless and all that. And so tried this. So you must, if you're a demographic historian, you must locate the dominant type of house. And so the dominant house type, and within that occurs a dominant domestic condition. So I would try to get that a history of one or two houses that are dominant and the history of how they were changed over time in 25 cities throughout America. I come with baggage. I've been in houses. I just go into houses every time I look. It's fun.
It is fun. All right. And you had mentioned that it's interesting to research your own house, and you encourage folks to research their own house if they're fortunate enough to live in an older house that then was electrified or a bathroom was added. Do you have any tips on how to help find those dates of when that electricity was added or where to look?
Some cities have elaborate plumbing records or construction records. Others don't. It's really a hodgepodge. I think your best route is to gather some local experts, local contractors to examine with you. Your eyes aren't good enough. I've been in hundreds and thousands of houses, and my eyes get better at doing that. I'm not brilliant, but you got to crunch numbers. So there's lots of people who've been in houses, UPS delivery people, but they don't look at houses. So you're looking for a couple of people who understand how houses have been changed over time. And what you want to get good at is visit other houses that are like yours. All of a sudden you walk into another house and say, oh, they got to put a closet over there. I never understood why this little strip in the wall would have, and you see it in another type of house. So numbers help, but like to see a house that's been changed, particularly changed over time. And that's what most houses are. This rare house has never been changed. And working class houses really get changed. And so that becomes even much more difficult a subject. That's where you have to go to other kinds of houses. You'll never figure it out in a busted house that's been remodeled for tens of times. It's difficult. And it's why you go to Victorian houses that haven't been remodeled very much, and it's a whole lot easier. But it's a difficult, very patient subject. The guys who do this are guys who look at wood painting samples and all that. That's important, but then you got to expand into little electrical facilities, and it requires a broad range of expertise in some ways. So, but it's interesting. Don't give up.
And I have to read this comment from Richard Candy. It says, Tom, you haven't lost any of your enthusiasm. For sure.
Well, it's so easy to be enthusiastic about these houses. They're just so exciting. How could you? It's the history of people, and all houses have history. And so I know if you live in a humble house, you said there's a common thing about how it has a history. People have lived in it. They've grown up with children and all that. Find that history. Yeah, it won't be the Rockefellers. It'll be the Schwartzes. It'll be a little different, but it's exciting. The Tenement Museum in New York, I'm going to visit this and document some rooms coming up, try to make some drawings of it actually. But it's a wonderful example, of rare example of an urban houses, apartments that have been well documented. The people. I recommend going there because what you'll see there is almost unbelievably rare in terms of knowing the history of the working class and how they've changed and how they've got toilets and how they got more light in the rooms and things like that. So I'm making a plug for the Tenement Museum in New York, but it'll give you an inspiration to, and you can do it online. You go on their online little courses.
All right, the questions are rolling in now.
Okay.
Someone asked, what about rural areas? Were the improvements even later?
Yeah. Rural areas are different. So be careful. So when you talk about gas, for example, forget it. There's no gas. So anyway, then, for instance, water supply is very important. It's not coming from the city. But now you have hydraulic rams and you have cellar cisterns that are pumped up and windmills. Whew. Okay, it's a whole different animal of working. And so, you have local people who know that, historians, and you would go to them and say, what are the possibilities? Did I have drain pipes that came down to fill a cistern in the cellar? Or is it pumped off of a long, distant windmill, or hydraulic ram as a gravity feed? So it's out there. On the farm, some utilities are desired far more than others. The washing machine, either mechanical or way before a toilet. Okay. Now, if you're an urban, the toilet's number one. Civilization stops pretty quickly without the ability to have sewage leave a place. But on the farm, one can put those things off to another generation to feed animals, to get water to the housewife inside the house, far more important. So you have a different trajectory of improvement, and you have to understand that as you look differences between rural and urban areas. Very exciting and very different.
Okay, back to the city. Here's one. My daughter lived in a 3-story house that was only 2 units in Dorchester, that's outside of Boston. It had one half of the second floor divided. It had one half of the second floor divided for each unit. I think it was called a Philadelphia, supposedly a kit house. It did originally have gas lights that were converted to electricity. Any thoughts? I think it was built in 1894.
Dorchester is good. I used to live in Boston. I always wanted to just describe Boston houses. Boston is very complex, and the duplex in Boston, there's 28 varieties of the duplex within Dorchester. So this development of, now whether or not this is unique, I mean, a subdivision that the Smiths did for an interesting reason because their daughter was married, blah, 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 and it goes on and on, or it may be typical of houses in your region. You don't know that. And so finding that out is going to help you talk about whether the center house, center part of the second floor is subdivided. There's nothing wrong with that, but it might be unique and you don't know that. And so knowing that other houses are doing, and because people repeat things, and the further back you go in time, you don't have Home Depot to give you there's more standard ways of remodeling. So do your homework, look at similar houses, and you will find now whether that's unique or not, and then send me to Dorchester. Let's look at houses.
Okay, here's a great one relating to today's housing issues. I'm curious about thoughts about today's affordable housing crisis, and what lessons these early 20th century houses could teach us about providing more and much needed housing stock.
We have a lot to learn from historical houses. The idea of multi-unit housing that is humane and sensible. The idea of putting doors on different street locations so that the house looks single family but acts double. So I mean, you could jam 50 units on a site and crush it. So building affordable housing on the back portion of lots of small units. We're doing that in Portland, but there's limits which can destroy, I think, the quality of life too. So I think you can look back at alley housing, for example, small unit housing as examples. It's not a panacea. There are new solutions that are emerging, different types of lifestyles and living. So be alert to that. But look at your local housing, and they have solutions that I think fit in somehow to local neighborhoods, and that's important to look at. One of the more difficult subjects in our lifetime.
Okay, and one last question relates to the 5% of kid houses. And you had mentioned 5% were owner built. So were you saying the 5% were only owner built, or 5% kit houses? Are those two different categories?
Good.
Or the same?
I didn't mean to confuse. Those are two different categories.
Yeah, okay.
An owner builder is a unique person, and they always has been. And if you can think about the houses got more complex toward the end of the 19th century. They got more plumbing, they got electricity. And the people, the old pioneers who used to build, chop the wood and make the log cabin, they could no longer do that, okay? And so that becomes a specialized kind of area. And owner builders are specialized always within areas. There's a category you have to be careful about. Does the owner cooperate in the building? Now, that usually in the story, Mr. Jones built his house. Well, you find that Mr. Jones built the cabinets and all that, but he had a Polish builder who built most of it because he's a professional back there. And that sort of disappears in the story. That happens over and over again. I mean, of course, I study farms. It's easy because the farmer helps with the building construction of the barn. Absolutely, period. Does he have the knowledge or the wherewithal to build the barn? No, the professional builder does. So we can scope that out. It gets more complex in the city and all that. But
okay. So it's 1 o'clock. So I think I need to do my wrap up. Thank you so much, Tom. You have so much enthusiasm, and it is a fascinating topic, and the book is fascinating too. So I wasn't able to get through the whole thing prior to this program, but I certainly will. I just wanted to mention the book is available. It's University of Minnesota Press. Check out your local independent bookstore first before you go to Amazon. Yep, I'll hold it up too. Here it is. A couple quick program notes I wanted. Pardon?
Shameless self-promotion.
Oh,
sorry.
That's okay. It's a great book. A couple quick program notes I wanted to mention before we wrap up. May 3rd, our Preservation Achievement Award celebration via Zoom, recognizing outstanding preservation projects and leaders across New Hampshire. Registration is on our website, nhpreservation.org. Also, our May 14th Old Building and Trades Fair at Sanborn Mills Farm in Loudon, big, wonderful event promoting preservation trades, people in action. There's all kinds of great projects going on at the farm, and we will have all the farm employees doing these preservation trades on site that day and bringing in some other outside folks. Registration online, discounted tickets. There's also special tours, limited space available. So I encourage you to check out our website with all the details on that event. 2 barn tours this summer, one in Multiunit and one in Plainfield. Multiunit is June 11th. Plainfield is June 18th. And Tom Hubka will be speaking at the Rye Congregational Church, hosted by the Rye Historical Society, July 28th at 7 p.m. on his Little House, Big House, Back House, Barns, New Hampshire Humanities to Go program. All these you can get more details on our website, again, nhpreservation.org, and go to our calendar of events. Special thanks again to our Old House and Barn sponsors whose support allow us to offer these great educational programs. A full list of our sponsors is also on the website. And I want to thank you all so much for joining, especially for our members who are here today. I see lots of you, and we greatly appreciate your support. And if you're not yet a member, we encourage you to join. You can do so from our website to help us advocate for and to encourage investment in historic properties and grow the preservation movement. So again, thank you so much, Tom. It was a great talk. Encourage folks to buy his book and learn more about these houses that are everywhere, and we pass by them every day and probably haven't thought so deeply about them, but now we will think differently. So thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful afternoon.